Hi, I'm Dr. Keith Johnson. I'm reading from my book, If Life is a Grocery Store, I Need Better Coupons. And I'm reading the article that says, Learning to be Content. You know, sometimes the greatest teachings are philosophical and religious presentations that teach a person how to live by healing him with his thinking. Sometimes the hardest standards to live by and understand are the philosophical and religious teachings that are dictatorial, and yet you're not ready for the truths presented emotionally or otherwise. That's kind of how I felt after my motorcycle accident when I awoke in a hospital bed surrounded by medical personnel, having no idea what kind of physical shape I existed in, having no idea what had been done to me. I knew I'd been out of it for a while, and the way I felt now, I still wasn't convinced I was fully awake. There were many people around my bed that I recognized, but I knew when I tried to say hello that I was mixing up their names and couldn't remember who they were or why I was here. One of the greatest truths and finest guidelines for my life was when I was struggling with a scripture that admonished, "Whatever state I am in, therewith to be content." Somehow I found that thought comforted me often when I realized how messed up my thinking was and how mixed up my reality was with all of the fantasy that I'd learned. I received great consolation from the depth of that thought, but after my accident it became the hardest criteria of my life. And I've been wrestling with it ever since, making sure that I understood the difference between reality and fantasy. There were so many physical problems as a result of my accident that I had to allow time to clear my mind in order to understand what had happened to me, and I still don't understand completely. Evidently, I'd been dragged by the car on the street during the collision. Since the driver was 21 years old of age and had a revoked license, there's no telling what kind of reaction he had to his handling of the car that he drove. My pelvis was broken, I had a tracheotomy, oxygen had to be fed to my brain, and later I was to realize that my entire right side was paralyzed. Among other problems, quite a change for someone who had never spent a night in the hospital or ever had any surgery or seen a doctor more than once a year for a checkup. And I was supposed to be content with these problems, so I understood, let alone the ones that would later develop because of my physical condition. Suddenly I was forced to face the problems I'd never had to deal with before. I'd spent my life counseling young people and adults through various crises, but now, when a client spoke to me about problems they were having, they had a new intensity for me, a new meaning. If someone was physically hurting or impaired, when they spoke to me of their frustration, I began to realize what they were going through firsthand because I was going through the same thing. Even more than that, I recognized people that took their good health for granted, and as a result took a lot of other aspects of their life for granted as well. Now, if a man could walk, I envied his ability to stand on his own 2 feet. I used to love to walk, but then I didn't realize how much I'd taken such a gift for granted. When I first visited Las Vegas, I was so enamored by the lights in the hotels that I spent my first 28 hours walking the main strip and visiting the hotels and elaborate casinos and shows. I wanted to get familiar with the glitz and glamour so I could spend the rest of my limited time enjoying the strip and its allure. I love to walk. I love to explore. Now it was impossible for me to take those long walks because of my right leg, which didn't work, and I was more short of breath. Interestingly enough, I noted that my ears perked up when they hadn't before when my clients talked about their own physical infirmities and accidents that had either temporarily or permanently impaired them. And suddenly I began to identify with their problems. Reason enough, I thought, to be alive to appreciate the physical infirmities of others, something I had never identified with because I'd been so healthy all of my life. And I also became appreciative of the fact that many people who themselves were healthy had no identification of empathy for others that were physically hurt or impaired. And suddenly, I was more helpful, more aware of someone who was physically impaired and needed more help than I had previously realized. within the framework of my own struggle was the discovery that the more I adjusted to my injuries, the more I began to forget that I had them. I could have been angry, bitter, unhappy about my new impairment, but by choice, I decided to accept what had happened and work against the struggle and try to get healed. Well, I'm not yet healed, but I saw something in my vision of healing. Here's where I admit it, and I'm careful to say this. I ended up seeing a lot more visions after my medicine in the hospital. I sat in my room by myself with the lights out with the intent of spending a lot of time feeling very sorry for myself, wondering if I was ever going to walk normal again, thinking all the time how unprepared I'd been to be injured in any way. And somehow as I worked and prayed for my own healing, I began to become unexpectedly appreciative, and whether it was simply a heavenly voice or a mental revelation, I became unable to feel sorry for myself and instead was interrupted in my mind as I began to see life as a roller coaster, open to anyone who wants to take the ride, but restricted to those who are willing to ride the tracks. There are many ups and downs. Many of those are scary. How you ride is your choice. You can be scared, you can whimper, or you can enjoy. You can hold on or you can fall off. The ride may be torture the first time, but it's easy to find out when you finish the ride that it was not as bad as it could have been, and even enjoyable. No matter how bad things seem, everything eventually works out all right and becomes livable. It does take courage to face and overcome some of the hills and valleys. It also takes great love and patience by the ones who love you, who also have to put up with you and your moods. And essential to your recovery is your faith in God, who's going to make everything work out for the better. But we're given the promise that we are never handed more than we can endure. God is faithful to see us through our trials if we give him the chance, and when our trials are through, he's faithful to bless us greatly beyond all that we can ask or think. Yet, comfort comes from a lot of unexpected places. I was in the radio station running my weekly radio program. My guest was a good British friend of mine who had just been through some serious knee replacement surgery himself. During the time while I was playing a record for the Roadhog listeners, I mentioned to my friend that I was struggling, trying to achieve total healing from my own injuries. I stated how I made a stupid mistake of driving my motorcycle that night and regretted my decision to ignore my mother and take the car against her warnings. Well, my friend looked at me and clearly announced, "It's too late to worry about that now." You know, I was astounded by the succinct truth of that statement. He was right. It had happened. I had an accident, and I had to deal with it. And this was no time to worry about what could have been. It was time for me to choose to change my attitude and deal with my problems. After the discussion, I never looked back on wishing. I got to work on what could be, and I had to work on the premise that God would help me. The alternative was unthinkable. Psalm 30, the 5th verse says, "For his anger endures for a moment, in his favor is life. Weeping may endure for a night, but joy cometh in the morning."